Thank you all very much, and thank you, James, for that very generous. Thank you. And thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you for the warm welcome. Before I go any further, however, let me introduce my wife, Kimberly, who is somewhere down here, right here in the front, as a matter of fact. My dad told me the day I got married that a man who says he isn't afraid of his wife will lie about other things. So, always important to remember to introduce the really important person in your life. I want to also just say what a great honor it is to be here at CPAC with the largest annual gathering of conservatives anywhere around the country. And I know that as we gather here in February of 2011, there's already a lot of speculation about November of 2012. And I hope, and I'm betting, that 2012 is going to be the year when we not only take back the Senate, but also the White House. So CPAC, are you ready? Are you ready to go to work to make sure that we elect a conservative Senate and a conservative president in 2012? It is an honor for me to occupy the stage with so many of our party's great leaders. It's fair to say that I don't have the same national name recognition that some of my more famous Republican colleagues have. I've never had a book signing. I've been to Iowa plenty of times, but it's usually on the way to South Dakota. And the closest I've come to being on a reality TV show is C-SPAN's live coverage of the Senate floor. Now, it's not the most exciting television, but it did have a good ending last year because a number of my liberal colleagues got voted off. So, the truth is I spend most of my time either back in South Dakota talking to the folks who elected me or out here in the United States Senate working hard on their behalf. You see, my family's roots run deep in South Dakota. Back in 1906, two brothers named Nikolai and Matthew Yelsvik boarded a boat in Norway in search of the American dream. When they got to the shores of America, the only English words they knew were the words apple pie and coffee. The immigration officials thought that their name, which was spelled G-J-E-L-S-V-I-K, would be too difficult to spell and pronounce for people in this country, and so they asked him to change it. And so the two brothers picked the name of the farm where they worked near Bergen, Norway, which was the Thune farm. And so Nikolai Yelsvik became Nick Thune, my grandfather. With his new name and his new country, my grandfather set out to build a new life. He learned English, got a job building the railroad across South Dakota, and when he and his brother had saved up enough money, they started a small business. First a merchandising company, and then a hardware store. Norway was their homeland, but they made America their home. My grandfather had 3 sons, including my father, and he instilled in his boys Midwestern values that my parents in turn passed along to me and my 4 siblings. They taught us to live within our means, even if it means going without. They taught us to help our neighbor and to serve our community, to work hard and to pull our own weight. They taught us about the importance of family and the value of life. And they taught us to appreciate our freedom and liberty, gifts that come from being fortunate enough to live in the greatest country on earth. Because of my upbringing, I believe in things like limited government, fiscal responsibility, and personal accountability. I believe in the wisdom of our founders and the sanctity of our Constitution. And I believe that in order for our values to have meaning, our actions must match our words. If you're blessed enough to serve in public office, then you shouldn't just talk a good name about your values. You should cast your vote according to them. Back home in South Dakota, that's not a radical agenda. That's just common sense. But for those of us who value liberty and freedom, Washington, D.C. has been a pretty lonely place in the last couple of years. So I want to thank you for sending me some new friends this past November. In the House, Republicans now hold 242 seats and the Speaker's gavel. In the Senate, we may not have a majority yet, but we've got the kind of motivated and conservative minority that can make a big difference. In November, you sent conservative leaders to Washington, and you sent the President and his allies a message. The Liberal Party that they've been having on the taxpayer dime is over. Now, you'd think that the elections in Massachusetts and Virginia, New Jersey, and our midterm victories across the country, that President Obama would rethink his agenda and modify his approach. I was listening for a sign of that in his State of the Union address last month. Now, as you know, this year in the State of the Union address, we did things a little differently. Democrats invited their favorite Republican to sit with them. So I sat with Senator Gillibrand from New York and Senator Carper from Delaware. Apparently it takes two Democrats to balance me out. But let me make one thing perfectly clear. A new seating arrangement is not bipartisanship, and new rhetoric is not a new agenda. The President last year, for example, talked a lot about supporting clean energy. And he kind of started by recycling his speech from last year. If you look at his speech last year, the President talked about a 3-year freeze on spending. This year he talked about a 5-year freeze on spending. Last year he talked about pushing through trade agreements with South Korea, Panama, and Colombia. This year he talked about, you guessed it, trade agreements with South Korea, Panama, and Colombia. Last year the President talked about spending. This year he talked about investment. For those of you who don't have your Obama State of the Union decoder ring, investment is just another Washington word for more spending. When this administration talks about making an investment, I think a lot of us know by now what kind of return we can expect. More government, more debt, fewer jobs, and less freedom. If the State of the Union address is any indication, 2011 is shaping up to be more of the same. It's disappointing, but it's not surprising. After all, these are the folks who took over auto companies, insurance companies, and banks. They jammed through Obamacare, a $2.5 trillion entitlement that we don't want and can't afford. And when members of their own party won't support this administration's legislative schemes, they go around the people's elected representatives and try and do it without them by executive power grabs. They couldn't pass the cap and tax bill, so they got the EPA doing their dirty work. They couldn't pass the card check bill, and so now the National Labor Relations Board is trying to take away a worker's right to cast a secret ballot. And now the Obama FCC is trying to take over the internet. Since 2008, we have witnessed the largest expansion in the size of government since the 1960s. All that government means a lot less freedom, and it comes with a hefty price tag. It took 43 presidents more than 200 years to rack up the first $5.8 trillion of publicly held debt in this country. Under the Obama administration's last budget, we will double that in 5 years and triple it in 10. And we're paying for it with borrowed money. Last year, over 40 cents out of every dollar the federal government spent came from places like China. President Obama likes to talk about winning the future, but someone needs to tell him, you can't win the prosperity of tomorrow if you're mortgaging it to pay for the big government programs of today. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a time of serious challenge. Unemployment is 9%. We're running huge deficits as far as the eye can see. The federal debt is now more than $14 trillion. In fact, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military official in this country, said a few months back that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Now that speaks volumes, because the threats that we face abroad are great and grave. Islamic extremism, an unstable Middle East, a potentially nuclear Iran, an ascendant China with its growing military capability, and a dangerous North Korea armed with nuclear weapons. The only thing more alarming than these threats is the President's weak response. We can't win the peace with apologies and reset buttons and deep cuts to our national defense. And we can't win the peace if we don't tell it like it is. An act of terrorism is just that, terrorism. Calling it a man-caused disaster doesn't change the gravity of the threat. It only makes us question this administration's will to defeat it. You know, we face serious challenges that require serious solutions. And if we lived in any other country of the world, I'd be worried whether or not we were up to the job. But the American way is to turn adversity into opportunity. For those who came before us, men and women like my grandparents and my parents, survived 2 world wars. They weathered a Great Depression. They took down an evil empire. And they brought the light of freedom to the darkest corners of the world. They turned this country into the greatest nation the world has ever known. Not by reinventing themselves, but by holding fast to America's most sacred values and defining principles. We don't need to fundamentally transform America. We need to stay true to who we are. And despite what President Obama believes, we don't need a new foundation. Our old foundation works just fine. You know, a few days ago, we celebrated what would have been Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday. Reagan assumed the presidency at one of the most challenging periods in our nation's history. But he knew that the challenges before us were no match for the good that resides within us. Reagan showed that there can be great hope in the midst of great despair, that there can be great joy in great sacrifice, that if we stick to our convictions, good things can come from hard times. What a contrast to our current president. You know, President Obama claims to admire Ronald Reagan quite a bit. For someone who says he admires the former president so much, he seems to understand very little about really who he was. Ronald Reagan knew that what makes America exceptional isn't our government, but our people and our ideals. And he knew that the truest measure of our success is not how much our government can do for us, but how much our people can achieve. Reagan's leadership is a guiding example for today. He once said there are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. We must have the courage to do what we know is morally right. We should take President Reagan's sound advice. And we can start by reforming the way that Washington, D.C. does business. Let's put an end to the backroom deals and the big government ways that have become the hallmark of this administration. Congress is the people's house, and the people have a right to know what goes on there. And those elected to serve in Congress should respect the people's money by spending less and saving more. So instead of freezing spending at the bloated levels that we know today, which is what the president wants to do, let's go back to the spending levels of 2008. Let's adopt a 2-year budget that spends money in the odd-numbered years and saves money in the even-numbered years when people go home to run for re-election. Let's make elections about how much we can save, not how much we can spend. And let's create a new congressional committee whose sole purpose it is to reduce the deficit by cutting spending. You may not know this, but there are 26 committees in Congress, committees or subcommittees, that spend your money. Isn't it time that we have at least one dedicated to saving your money? And if American families are making tough choices to live within their means, and the federal government should show some fiscal discipline and balance its books as well, the time has come to finally pass a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. If we're going to get our fiscal house in order and our economy up and running, we're also going to need to reform Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That requires bold leadership and a bipartisan approach. President Obama talks a lot about both, but he doesn't seem capable of either. So if we're going to solve our entitlement problem in this country, we're going to need to solve our White House problem by electing a conservative president in 2012. When it comes to Obamacare, it's great to see that the courts got this one right too, by recognizing that this costly mess is also unconstitutional. In Congress, my Republican colleagues and I are working hard to get the votes to repeal it and to replace it. But in the meantime, we can and should defund it. And if this administration can grant waivers to its favorite friends, then we ought to allow every state in the union to opt out as well. When it comes to the issue of energy, we need to stop sending billions and billions of dollars every single year to foreign regimes for resources that we can and should develop right here at home. We need an energy plan that encourages all forms of American energy, one that produces American resources and creates American jobs. When it comes to the issue of national security, let's win the wars of today and prepare for the threats of tomorrow. Let's stand by our troops and make sure that they have the resources that they need to complete their missions. And let's stand with those around the world who are risking their lives for freedom. And let's stand up for our allies, like Israel. And let's stand up to our enemies, like the radical Islamic extremists who seek to harm our friends and destroy our way of life. You know, despite what some in this administration think, our men and women in uniform are not engaged in an overseas contingency operation. They are fighting a global war on terror. And that is a fight. That is a fight that we need all elements of our national power to win. We need to use lawful interrogation techniques to acquire actionable intelligence. And when we are done interrogating terrorists, we should give them their day in court in a military tribunal, not an American courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a tough road ahead if we're going to get America back on track. We face some hard choices, and we need to make the right decisions. And there will be opposition to our agenda and to our ideas. But as I look out at what lies before us, I'm reminded of my first Senate race back in 2002. It was a tough, hard-hitting campaign in a close election. And I ended up losing by 524 votes. It was the kind of experience that could make you want to pack it in, to sit it out the next time around. In fact, I remember sitting in our living room in Sioux Falls, South Dakota with my wife Kimberly, and shortly after the election, she looked at me and she said, I am not going through another campaign unless God himself comes to the door and says, you have to run. So I probably don't think that's going to happen. But it's funny, because as the year wore on and we got in and people started talking about the 2004 election and who was going to run against Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle, we were having a discussion as we were contemplating that race in our living room again. And my wife looked at me and she said, I have finally concluded and realized that what we went through in losing that 2002 Senate race wasn't just about the winning. It was about the race. Like, what? Of course it was about the winning. I was a competitor. I'm in this to win. But she made a really important observation, ladies and gentlemen, that it's important to be in the race, that it's important to be in the arena, that it's important to be out there standing up and fighting for the things that we believe in. She was right then, and she's right now. Now, I know that everybody here, I know that you all know that, because you've chosen to get in the arena and fight. You've made our conservative convictions your call to action. In the battle between more government and more freedom, you're fighting for freedom. And in the battle between liberty and dependency, you're fighting for liberty. Together we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go and a lot more to do. We need to get this country back to the values that made my grandfather and so many like him risk it all to come and reach our shores. We need to protect the principles that men like my father fought for in battlefields and faraway places. Their legacy is our call to action. We need to ask ourselves today, what sacrifices are we willing to make to secure America's future? What will we do to ensure that the great American experiment does not end on our watch? And the answer is that we've got to get back in the trenches and fight for the values and the ideals and the principles that made this the greatest country on the earth. For my part, I'll be using every tool our founders gave us to expand liberty, to expand freedom, and to stop the growth of government. And when the Democrats try to regulate what they can't legislate, I will throw every obstacle I possibly can in their path. And when they try to increase spending and push their liberal agenda, I will be on the front lines voting no. On Monday, after this CPAC celebration is over, I'm going back to work, and I hope you will too. I hope you'll go back to your communities and keep speaking out, keep holding Washington accountable, and keep making your voice heard. We may not win every battle every time, but as Winston Churchill said, success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts. So let's make our convictions our calling. Let's get back in the arena. Let's have the courage to continue our fight. Let's expand our movement. And together, let's make 2012 our moment. Thank you. God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you.